The last thing Samuel Brooks ever said to his sons wasn't about money, it wasn't about land, and it certainly wasn't about inheritance. It was one sentence spoken through an oxygen mask 3 days before he died. One of you learned how to make a living. His voice had been weak, barely audible. Then he looked past the hospital monitors, past the pale winter light falling through the window, and fixed his eyes on the younger son. The other learned how to build a life. Nobody in the room understood what he meant, least of all Marcus, especially Marcus. Because if there was one thing everyone in Macon County, Georgia agreed on, it was this. Marcus Brooks was the success story. Elijah Brooks was not. The brothers stood only a few feet apart beside their father's hospital bed. Yet they might as well have lived on different planets. Marcus was 38. Owner of Brooks Agricultural Solutions. 200 employees. Magazine features. Industry awards. A black F-350 Platinum truck that cost more than most people in town earned in a year. People shook his hand differently. They listened when he spoke. They used words like visionary, leader, builder. Elijah was 33. He drove a faded white Chevrolet pickup with mismatched doors, worked odd jobs, repaired irrigation systems, helped neighbors fix equipment, never married, never owned a business, never appeared in newspapers. When people talked about Samuel Brooks's children, they usually mentioned Elijah second. Sometimes they forgot to mention him at all. The heart monitor beeped quietly. Samuel's eyes remained on Elijah. For a moment something passed between father and son, something private. Something Marcus noticed immediately. His jaw tightened. The old feeling returned. The same feeling he'd carried since childhood. The feeling that somehow Elijah always occupied a place inside their father that Marcus could never reach. The nurse entered. Visiting hours were over. 2 days later Samuel Brooks died, and the entire county showed up to the funeral. Because Samuel had spent 41 years teaching vocational agriculture at the local high school. Generations of farmers had sat in his classroom. Generations of mechanics, business owners, teachers, county commissioners. People came from 3 states away. Some arrived wearing expensive suits. Others came straight from fields, still covered in red Georgia clay. The church parking lot overflowed. The sanctuary filled beyond capacity. Yet despite all the stories people shared that day, one detail kept surfacing. Nobody could remember Samuel ever asking anyone for a favor. But everyone remembered him helping someone else. The funeral ended shortly after noon. The real storm began 2 hours later, inside a law office on Main Street. 22 people sat around a long oak table. Family members, attorneys, witnesses. Marcus sat confidently at the head. Elijah sat near the window, quiet as always. The attorney opened a folder, cleared his throat, and began reading. The first portion seemed predictable: investment accounts, retirements, life insurance. Then came the land. The Brooks family farm covered nearly 200 acres, prime farmland, debt-free, worth a substantial amount. Marcus straightened slightly. Several relatives glanced toward him. Everyone assumed they knew what was coming. Samuel had always talked about legacy, continuation, growth. Marcus had built a farming empire. Of course he would inherit the operation. The attorney adjusted his glasses. The farmland, primary residence, grain storage facilities, and agricultural equipment shall transfer entirely to my eldest son, Marcus Brooks. A murmur traveled around the room. Nobody looked surprised. Marcus nodded, exactly as expected. Then the attorney continued. My younger son, Elijah Brooks, shall receive ownership of Structure 4. Silence. The attorney turned a page. Along with all contents currently contained therein. Nobody spoke. For several seconds the room seemed confused. Then one cousin frowned. Structure 4? The attorney checked the document. The old maintenance warehouse behind the western tree line. A few people blinked. Someone actually laughed. The warehouse? The abandoned one? The place hadn't been used in years. Its roof leaked. The electrical system barely worked. Most people assumed it should have been demolished. Marcus stared across the table, then looked at Elijah, waiting for some reaction. There wasn't one. Elijah simply sat there, hands folded, expression unreadable. The attorney wasn't finished. There is one additional instruction. The room quieted. He unfolded a handwritten note. Samuel's handwriting, recognizable immediately. If Elijah chooses to open the warehouse, he must do so alone. The attorney paused, then read the final line. And if he ever discovers why I left it to him, he will understand who inherited the most valuable thing I owned. This time nobody laughed. The room became strangely still. Marcus leaned forward. What does that mean? The attorney shook his head. I have no idea. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. Outside, relatives clustered in small groups, speculating, guessing, creating theories. Most concluded the same thing. Samuel had simply become sentimental near the end. Old people did that. Marcus approached Elijah near the parking lot. You know something? It wasn't a question. Elijah shook his head. No, you talked to him before he died. So did you. Not like that. A cold January wind moved through the trees. Elijah looked toward the horizon. The same fields their father had spent 4 decades protecting stretched beneath gray clouds. He never told me what was inside. Marcus studied him, trying to determine whether he believed that. I'm serious, I know. For a moment neither man spoke. Then Marcus laughed softly. Not cruelly, almost sympathetically. Well, he shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I guess you inherited the most expensive storage shed in Georgia. Several relatives nearby chuckled. Elijah smiled politely. Nothing more. That irritated Marcus even more than an argument would have. 3 days later, Elijah drove out to the western edge of the property. Alone, exactly as the note instructed. The warehouse stood beyond a line of pine trees, weathered, silent, half hidden beneath decades of neglect. He parked his truck, stepped out. The afternoon air smelled of rain. The padlock hanging from the door wasn't old. It was new, recently installed. His father had placed it there during his final months. That alone made Elijah's stomach tighten. Samuel had planned this. Carefully. Deliberately. Elijah unlocked the door, the hinges groaned. Dust drifted through beams of sunlight cutting across the darkness. At first glance the building looked exactly as everyone expected. Old shelves. Broken tools. Unused machinery. Nothing valuable. Nothing mysterious. Nothing worth dividing in a will. Then he noticed something. The floor. Near the back wall. A section of concrete looked different. Newer, poured recently. His heartbeat quickened. He crossed the warehouse, kneeled. Ran his fingers across the surface. Fresh concrete. Less than a year old. Directly in the center sat a steel ring embedded in the floor. Elijah grabbed it, pulled. The concrete section lifted upward like a hatch, and beneath it was a staircase. A staircase leading underground. His father had built a hidden room. Nobody had ever mentioned it. Nobody even knew it existed. Cool air drifted upward from the darkness below. Elijah stood frozen, listening. The warehouse was silent. The farm was silent. The world felt silent. Then he saw something at the bottom of the stairs, a single metal desk, and on top of it sat a black lockbox. Beside it rested dozens of thick notebooks, hundreds of pages, carefully organized, waiting, as if Samuel Brooks had expected this exact moment. Elijah took one step downward, then another, and as he descended into the hidden room, he noticed 4 words written across the top notebook in his father's handwriting. If Marcus finds this. Elijah stopped. His pulse hammered inside his chest, because suddenly he realized something terrifying. This wasn't an inheritance, it was a secret. And whatever Samuel Brooks had spent years hiding from the entire family was waiting inside that room. The room beneath the warehouse was larger than Elijah expected. Not luxurious, not secret agent dramatic, just practical. Very much like Samuel Brooks, concrete walls, metal shelves, a workbench scarred by years of use, a small refrigerator humming quietly in the corner, an old floor lamp, a filing cabinet, and notebooks. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, they filled entire shelves. Each labeled by year 1984, 1985, 1986, all the way to the year Samuel died. Elijah picked up the notebook on top, the one with the words, if Marcus finds this. His father's handwriting looked exactly the same as it had when Elijah was a child. Neat, patient, deliberate. He opened the cover. The first page contained only one sentence. If Marcus is reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. Elijah frowned. The next page began like a letter. Marcus. If you found this before Elijah did, then I failed. Not as a teacher, not as a farmer, as a father. Because what I am about to tell you was never meant to be discovered during a time of success. Only during a time of need. Elijah slowly lowered the notebook. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He wasn't reading a will. He wasn't reading instructions. He was reading something much more personal. Something Samuel had spent years preparing. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the warehouse roof. Inside, the lamp cast long shadows across the room. Elijah kept reading. The first notebook contained no secrets, at least not the kind people imagined. No hidden fortune, no gold coins, no buried deeds. Instead, it contained stories, hundreds of stories, real people, real names, real failures. Samuel had documented nearly every major financial collapse in the county over 40 years. Contractors, mechanics, small business owners, people who lost everything, and beside each story Samuel had written observations, not judgments. Lessons, patterns, mistakes. The notes read like a professor studying human behavior. One entry described a farmer who doubled his acreage during a commodity boom. 3 years later he lost all of it. Another involved a roofing company owner who borrowed heavily to expand into neighboring counties. The business grew. Then a recession arrived. The loans survived longer than the profits. Samuel's notes always ended the same way. What did they ignore? What warning sign did they miss? What could have been done differently? Elijah flipped page after page. His father hadn't been collecting stories. He'd been studying decisions. By midnight he had read almost 300 pages. The deeper he went, the more one theme appeared. Debt wasn't the villain, pride was. Again and again Samuel returned to the same observation. People rarely failed because they lacked information. They failed because success convinced them they no longer needed advice. Elijah sat back, exhausted. The room suddenly felt smaller, the silence heavier. Then he noticed something else. The notebooks were color-coded. Most were black, a few were blue, only 3 were red. The red notebook sat alone on the highest shelf. He climbed a ladder and carefully removed the first one. Its label read 1997. For a moment he simply stared. That year mattered. That was the year his mother died. Elijah carried the notebook to the desk, opened it and immediately froze. The first page contained a photograph, not of a farm, not of his mother, not of the family, a bank building, the old Macon County Savings Bank. Beneath the photograph Samuel had written, the year everything almost disappeared. Elijah turned the page. The story that followed felt different from the others, more emotional, less analytical, almost painful. 27 years ago Marcus nearly lost his future. Elijah stopped breathing for a second. Marcus? He read faster. When Marcus was 11 years old, he had been selected for a prestigious agricultural science academy. A program that eventually opened doors to scholarships, internships, and opportunities that shaped his entire career. Everyone in the family always believed Marcus earned his place through talent alone. And he had, partly, but there was more. A lot more. Samuel wrote about the day the acceptance letter arrived. The family celebrated. Then disaster struck. A week later Samuel discovered an accounting error at the bank where most of their savings were held. The bank collapsed during a fraud investigation. Nearly everything the family had saved disappeared overnight. The tuition money vanished. The travel expenses vanished. The future they planned vanished. Samuel described sitting alone in his truck behind the bank, trying to figure out how to tell his son, how to explain that opportunity sometimes arrives before money does. Then the story took an unexpected turn. A local mechanic named Leonard Hayes appeared. Elijah knew the name, everyone knew the name. Leonard had died years ago, a quiet man. Never wealthy, at least not publicly. According to Samuel's notes, Leonard had overheard part of the conversation. That night he showed up at the Brooks house. Without warning, without invitation, without publicity, he handed Samuel an envelope. Inside was enough money to cover every expense Marcus needed. No contract, no interest, no repayment schedule, just trust. Samuel asked why Leonard gave one answer. Because somebody did it for me once. Elijah felt a chill run through him. He continued reading. Marcus never knew, neither son knew, not until this moment. The money had never been mentioned again. Years later Samuel attempted to repay Leonard. Leonard refused, every time. Then Samuel wrote something that made Elijah sit completely still. The reason I built this room is because I realized something after Leonard died. The most valuable assets in a community never appear on balance sheets. Trust, reputation, character. Those things compound longer than money ever will. Elijah stared at the page. Rain hammered harder against the roof now. The fluorescent light flickered briefly. For the first time he began to understand what his father had really been building all these years. Not wealth, not property. A map of human decisions, human failures, human generosity, human consequences. Then he noticed a sealed envelope taped to the inside cover. His name was written across it, Elijah. Only open this after reading the first red notebook. His hands suddenly felt cold. He opened the envelope carefully. A single sheet of paper slid onto the desk. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written during Samuel's final months. Elijah, if you are reading this, then I was right. You stayed curious long enough to keep looking. Marcus inherited the farm because he believes assets create security. Most people believe that. I don't blame him, but I left this room to you because you understand something he never noticed. People. You pay attention to people. You always have. That matters more than you realize. Then came the final paragraph, and it changed everything. There is one more truth I never told either of you. A truth that will become important sooner than you think. Marcus's company is already in danger. He doesn't know it yet, but I do. The signs are all here. I have been watching them for 3 years, and when the storm arrives, he will need something that cannot be borrowed from a bank. Elijah's pulse accelerated. He read the sentence again. Marcus's company is already in danger. The date on the letter was 8 months before Samuel died. 8 months. His father had seen something coming. Something Marcus had missed. Something serious enough to write down as his final warning. Elijah turned the page over. There was one final instruction. The answer is in the second red notebook. Do not tell Marcus until you understand it yourself. Outside, thunder rolled across the Georgia countryside. Deep, distant, unsettling. Elijah slowly lifted his eyes toward the shelf where the remaining red notebooks waited. For the first time since his father's funeral, he wasn't thinking about inheritance. He wasn't thinking about land. He wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about a question. What had Samuel Brooks seen 8 months before his death that convinced him his most successful son was walking directly toward a disaster nobody else could see? 3 weeks later, Elijah still hadn't told Marcus what he had found. Not because he wanted to hide it, because he wasn't sure he understood it himself. Every evening after work he returned to the underground room. The routine became strangely comforting. The same metal desk, the same lamp, the same notebooks, the same silence. Outside, winter slowly surrendered to spring. Inside, Samuel Brooks continued teaching lessons from beyond the grave. The second red notebook sat open before him. And the deeper Elijah read, the more unsettled he became. Because Samuel wasn't describing a future possibility, he was documenting a pattern. A pattern he had seen many times before. A pattern that seemed to repeat every generation. The notebook contained a title, The Most Dangerous Stage of Success. Below it, Samuel had listed dozens of businesses. Some had failed, some survived, some still existed. But all had passed through the same stage. Revenue increased, confidence increased, praise increased. Then something else happened. Leaders stopped to ask questions. Success slowly transformed into certainty. Certainty transformed into blindness. And blindness eventually became risk. Not because people were foolish, because they became comfortable. One page contained a sentence underlined 3 times. Nobody notices a crack while the building is still standing. Elijah stared at those words for a long time. Then he turned another page and found Marcus's name. His stomach tightened. Samuel had created an entire section dedicated to his oldest son. Not criticism. Observation, year by year, decision by decision, growth by growth. The entries stretched back almost 5 years. At first they seemed harmless. Marcus expanded his logistics division. Good move. Marcus negotiated a regional supply agreement. Strong opportunity. Marcus acquired additional storage capacity. Reasonable risk. Then the notes gradually changed tone. The praise became cautious. The observations became sharper. Questions appeared in the margins. Why only one buyer? Where is the contingency plan? What happens if the contract changes? Why is nobody asking this question? Elijah leaned forward. He continued reading. And suddenly the entire picture emerged. Samuel wasn't worried about debt. At least not primarily. He was worried about dependence. Marcus's company had become increasingly reliant on a single agricultural distribution corporation based in Atlanta. Southeastern Harvest Group. The partnership looked brilliant from the outside. Industry publications praised it. Local newspapers praised it. Investors praised it. The county praised it. The agreement guaranteed large-scale purchasing contracts for local crops. Steady revenue. Predictable growth. Expansion opportunities. Everything sounded perfect. Too perfect. Samuel had highlighted one section in red ink. When everyone agrees something's safe, look closer. Elijah sat back. The room felt colder, because he remembered hearing that company name many times. Southeastern Harvest. Marcus talked about them constantly. The contract had transformed his business. It had helped him expand, hire workers, purchase equipment, win awards, build influence. And now Elijah was reading dozens of pages explaining why Samuel believed that same contract represented the greatest threat Marcus had ever faced. Not because the company was dishonest. Because Marcus had become dependent. A single point of failure, one broken link, one policy change, one market shift, and everything could unravel. The next page contained something even more troubling. A printed email. Samuel had somehow obtained it through a former student working in agricultural finance. The message discussed restructuring plans. Nothing illegal, nothing scandalous. But buried inside corporate language was a possibility. Southeastern Harvest was considering centralizing operations, reducing regional partnerships, consolidating suppliers. The document was nearly a year old. Samuel had circled one paragraph. If this happens, hundreds of local businesses will be exposed. Elijah slowly exhaled. The warning wasn't dramatic, that made it worse. Real disasters rarely announce themselves with sirens. Most arrived disguised as ordinary paperwork. The following Saturday morning he drove into town. Not to see Marcus, not yet. Instead he visited the county library, then the courthouse, then the Chamber of Commerce office. He spent the entire day researching, cross-checking, verifying, trying to prove his father wrong. Instead, every fact seemed to support Samuel's concerns. By evening Elijah sat alone in his truck outside a gas station. A half-finished coffee rested in the cup holder. Rainwater slid slowly across the windshield. His phone buzzed. "Marcus," Elijah answered. "You alive?" A small smile appeared. "Last time I checked. You coming to dinner tomorrow?" "Maybe. Maybe." Marcus laughed. "You disappear for 3 weeks after Dad's funeral and now you answer like a federal witness." Elijah looked out the window. Traffic moved through downtown Macon. People heading home. Normal lives. Normal worries. Meanwhile, a question kept growing inside his head. How much danger was Marcus actually in? "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Yeah, you sound tired. Just working." Marcus was quiet for a second, then spoke more softly. "You know, for what it's worth." Elijah waited. "I've been thinking about that warehouse." "What about it?" "I was kind of a jerk." The admission surprised him. Marcus laughed awkwardly. "Okay, more than kind of." Another pause. "If Dad left it to you, there was probably a reason." For the first time since the funeral, Elijah felt something shift. Not completely, just slightly. A crack in a wall that had existed for decades. "Thanks. Don't make me repeat it." The call ended, but the conversation stayed with him. Because for the first time, Elijah wasn't looking at Marcus as the arrogant older brother who always seemed successful. He was looking at him as a man standing on ground that might not be as solid as everyone believed, including Marcus himself. 2 weeks later, the first sign appeared. Small enough that nobody else noticed. Large enough that Elijah immediately recognized it. A local trucking company unexpectedly lost a transportation contract. The news barely registered in town. One business issue among thousands. Except that company handled deliveries for Southeastern Harvest. 3 days later, another supplier announced layoffs. Then another, then another. Each event looked unrelated. Each explanation sounded reasonable. Each headline seemed minor. Yet when Elijah placed them beside Samuel's notes, a disturbing pattern emerged. The dominoes had started moving. One Friday evening he drove past Brooks Agricultural Solutions. Marcus's headquarters occupied a renovated brick warehouse near the highway. The parking lot was full. The company sign glowed brightly against the evening sky. Employees laughed as they exited the building. Everything looked healthy, successful, thriving. Exactly the way Samuel said danger often looked from the outside. Then Elijah noticed something. 3 black SUVs parked near the executive entrance. Out-of-state license plates. Men in business suits carrying folders. Nobody smiling, nobody relaxed. A meeting, an important one. Elijah remained across the street for nearly 10 minutes, watching, waiting, observing. Eventually the doors opened, Marcus emerged. And even from that distance Elijah saw it. The expression. Not panic, not fear, concern, real concern. The kind a man tries very hard to hide. The visitors shook hands, got into their vehicles. Left. Marcus remained standing alone, staring at the parking lot, motionless, for almost a full minute. Then he pulled out his phone. Dialed someone, spoke briefly, hung up. And for the first time in his life, Elijah saw his brother look uncertain. The sight bothered him more than he expected. Because uncertainty was new territory for Marcus Brooks. The next morning Elijah returned to the underground room. He opened the final pages of the second red notebook. There, hidden near the end, Samuel had written his last major prediction. No dates. No dramatic language. Just one observation. If Marcus ever begins questioning the contract, it will already be too late. Elijah stared at the sentence, then turned the page. A folded document slipped onto the desk. Unlike everything else, this paper wasn't old. It had been added recently. Maybe during Samuel's final months. The envelope contained only 2 things, a list of names, and a handwritten note. The note read, "When the crisis becomes visible, these people will matter more than money. Protect the relationships." The names meant nothing at first. A mechanic, a retired teacher, a grain inspector, a church secretary, a truck driver, a banker who no longer worked in banking. Ordinary people. No CEOs, no investors, no politicians, no wealthy landowners, just ordinary names. Elijah looked back at the note, then at the list, then back at the note again, and suddenly a realization struck him. Hard. Samuel wasn't preparing a rescue plan, he was preparing a community. The hidden room had never been about predicting failure. It was about understanding what survives after failure. At that exact moment his phone vibrated. A text message from Marcus. Only 6 words. "Can you come by tomorrow morning? Need to talk." Elijah stared at the screen, then at the notebooks, then at the final red notebook still waiting unopened on the shelf. For the first time since entering the underground room, genuine unease settled into his chest. Because something had changed. Not in the notebooks. Not in the past. In the present. And whatever happened during that meeting with those executives yesterday. Marcus had finally noticed it too. The next morning Marcus looked older. Not dramatically, not the kind of change people notice immediately. Just small things, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the untouched coffee cooling beside him, the way he kept rubbing the bridge of his nose, as if trying to push away a headache that refused to leave. Elijah sat across from him in the office conference room. The building was quiet. Most employees hadn't arrived yet. Outside, dawn light spilled across the parking lot. For several moments, neither brother spoke. Then Marcus slid a folder across the table. "You remember Southeastern Harvest?" Elijah nodded. Marcus gave a humorless laugh. "That's not a good sign. What happened?" Marcus looked toward the window. The silence stretched. Long enough for Elijah to realize how difficult the answer was. "They're restructuring." The words landed softly, but Elijah already knew their weight. Marcus opened the folder. Inside were letters, emails, corporate notices, official language, polite language. The kind of language that can destroy lives without ever sounding cruel. They're terminating regional partnerships over the next 18 months. Elijah remained still. Marcus continued. "They aren't shutting down. They aren't going bankrupt. They aren't breaking any laws. They're just changing their strategy." A bitter smile appeared. "And apparently that strategy no longer includes companies like mine." For the first time, Elijah saw the scale of it. Not just lost revenue, not just lost contracts. Entire sections of Marcus's business depended on that relationship. Warehouses, transportation, storage, equipment leases, payroll. Years of expansion built around one assumption, the assumption that the partnership would always exist. Samuel had seen it. Years ago, Marcus finally leaned back. "How did Dad know?" Elijah said nothing. "Not yet." Marcus stared at the table. "I spent half the night trying to understand it. Every advisor told me it was a great deal. Every consultant, every lender, every industry magazine." His voice dropped lower. "So why was my 70-year-old father the only person who saw the risk?" The question lingered between them. Elijah thought about the underground room, the notebooks, the stories, the decades of observation. Then he finally answered, "Because he wasn't studying agriculture." Marcus frowned. "What? He was studying people." The room became quiet again. This time Marcus didn't argue. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't completely sure he was right. The following weeks were difficult. Not catastrophic. Not yet. The company remained profitable. Employees still came to work. Contracts still existed. Life continued. But the direction had changed. Everyone could feel it. Nuka slowed. Expansion plans paused. Conversations became cautious. Questions appeared, then more questions. For years Marcus had always been the man with answers. Now he was becoming the man searching for them. One evening Elijah returned to the underground room. The final red notebook waited on the shelf. The last piece. The final lesson. He opened it carefully. The first page contained no analysis, no charts, no business observations, only a photograph. Samuel Brooks, Leonard Hayes, and 12 other people standing together outside a small church. The picture had been taken decades earlier. On the back someone had written, "The Circle." Elijah frowned. He turned the page. And suddenly everything made sense. The names, the list, the hidden room, the warehouse, even the inheritance. 40 years earlier, after Leonard Hayes saved Marcus's future, Samuel began meeting with a small group of local people. Not businessmen, not wealthy investors, ordinary people. A mechanic, a teacher, a nurse, a truck driver, a pastor, a banker, a widow who owned a diner. Whenever someone in the community faced a genuine crisis, they quietly helped. No publicity, no newspaper stories, no recognition. Sometimes they provided advice, sometimes introductions, sometimes temporary work, sometimes emergency assistance, whatever was needed. Over time the group grew. People joined. People passed away. New people replaced them, but the mission remained. Protect the community before the crisis becomes a tragedy. Samuel had spent 40 years building it. Not a business, a network of trust. The final pages contained one sentence. The strongest communities are not built by successful people. They are built by useful people. Elijah sat frozen, because suddenly he understood what his father had meant. The most valuable thing Samuel owned had never been hidden underground. The room wasn't the inheritance, the relationships were. His phone rang. "Marcus, again. Can you meet me at the warehouse? Now?" "Yeah." Marcus hesitated. Something strange happened. 20 minutes later Elijah arrived. The company parking lot was full. Far fuller than it should have been on a Thursday evening. Cars lined both sides of the street, pickup trucks, old sedans, work vans, vehicles from every corner of the county. People stood outside talking, waiting, watching. Elijah stepped out of his truck. "What is this?" Marcus looked genuinely confused. "I don't know. About an hour ago people just started showing up." Then a familiar voice called out. "About time you boys got here." An older man stepped forward. Harold Jefferson, retired mechanic. One of the names from Samuel's list. Then another person appeared, and another, and another. The retired school principal, the truck driver, the diner owner, the church secretary, dozens of people, then hundreds. Some Elijah recognized, many he didn't. Marcus looked stunned. What is going on? Harold smiled. Your daddy's going on. Not mockingly, warmly, like family. Harold held up an old notebook. We got a call. A call from who? The people your father trusted. More people stepped forward, each carrying something: folders, contacts, business proposals, potential clients, transportation contracts, storage opportunities, new partnerships. Not charity, opportunity, real opportunity. The kind built through relationships. The kind that takes decades to earn. One woman approached Marcus. You probably don't remember me. Marcus shook his head. My husband died 12 years ago. Your father helped me keep my house. Another man stepped forward. Samuel got my son his first apprenticeship. Then another. He helped me after my accident. Then another. He taught me bookkeeping when my business nearly failed. Then another and another and another. For nearly an hour the stories continued. Marcus stood silently listening. At some point tears appeared. Not dramatic tears. The kind a grown man tries unsuccessfully to hide. Because he was finally seeing something his father understood long ago. Influence isn't the same thing as respect. Success isn't the same thing as trust. And reputation built through kindness survives longer than reputation built through achievement. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Business cards had changed hands. Meetings had been scheduled. Ideas had formed, possibilities existed. Nothing was guaranteed. No miracle had occurred. The company was still facing challenges, but it wasn't alone anymore. That changed everything. Later that night the brothers sat on the tailgate of Elijah's truck. The parking lot finally empty, the air cool, the sky clear. Marcus stared toward the dark warehouse. You know something? What? For years I thought Dad left me the important stuff. Elijah smiled. The land, the buildings, the equipment. Marcus nodded. Turns out he left me assets, and left you the reason the assets mattered. Neither spoke for a while. The silence felt comfortable. Different than before. Healing. Eventually Marcus laughed softly. You know what's funny? What? I spent 20 years trying to build the biggest company in the county. He looked toward the road where the last car disappeared into the darkness. Dad spent 40 years building something I couldn't even see. Months later Brooks Agricultural Solutions survived. Not because of a bailout. Not because of luck. Not because of a miracle contract. The company became smaller, leaner, healthier, more diversified, less dependent. Marcus made difficult decisions, painful decisions, necessary decisions. And for the first time he asked questions before making assumptions. 5 years later the business looked very different. Still successful, but grounded. More importantly, Marcus was different. One Thanksgiving evening, the entire family gathered at the farm. Children ran through the yard. Laughter drifted from the kitchen. The old warehouse still stood beyond the tree line. No longer abandoned, no longer hidden. Before dinner Marcus raised a glass. His eyes settled on the empty chair they always left for Samuel. Then he smiled. When I was younger I thought wealth was what you owned. The room quieted. I was wrong. He glanced toward Elijah. Wealth is how many people answer the phone when your life starts falling apart. Nobody spoke. They didn't need to. Because everyone in the room already understood. Some lessons arrive through success. The important ones usually arrive through struggle. And sometimes the greatest inheritance a parent leaves behind isn't land, or money, or a business. It's a reputation strong enough to keep helping people long after they're gone. That was Samuel Brooks's real legacy. And unlike every other asset he owned, it only became more valuable with time. Disclaimer. This story is a fictional narrative inspired by real challenges faced by families, businesses, and rural communities across America. The characters and events are fictional, but the themes of trust, financial responsibility, community support, and long-term thinking reflect experiences many people have lived through. Personally, what stays with me most is not the business crisis. It is the reminder that success can attract attention, but character earns loyalty. And when difficult seasons arrive, the people who stand beside us often become the most valuable wealth we ever possess.